So how do we work the soil and prepare that soil and do a little bit of gardening to help create those, what we were talking about, favorable conditions, in this case, for the reception of the one true gospel? How can we show people the way when we can't overtly tell them that Jesus is the way? Hey guys, I'm Bill Westers, and this is the Encountering Truth podcast. Welcome to the Encountering Truth podcast, where we examine the evidence for Christianity, engage culture with kindness and conviction, and encounter Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. About a year ago, I released an episode called How Do You Talk About God When You Can't Talk About God? And that episode was based on a presentation that I gave at the Cross-Examined Instructors Academy, hosted by Frank Turek and others. And the goal was to equip Christians with some ways to talk around God when they can't talk openly about Him, or how to lead people towards Christ when we can't lead people to Christ. The idea is that there are certain circumstances that prohibit us from openly sharing our faith with others sometimes. And so that might be related to a job situation, like in a public school, or your boss not really wanting you to talk about that. Or it might just be with certain individuals who tend to kind of shut down or throw up walls immediately at just the very mention of any kind of God talk, right? Well, over the last year or so, I've expanded that presentation, and I recently shared it at a meeting for the Michigan Apologetics Network. And so I thought I would create a follow-up episode providing more ways to talk about God when you can't talk about God. So before we jump in, I do want to clarify that what we're talking about here, and in that first episode that we did about this, is not just trying to sneakily or dishonestly find ways to skirt around the law, to break the rules, and try to do all of this just without getting caught, okay? We're not trying to use secret codes, code words, or esoteric language, or as if we're like some kind of undercover agents involved in some plot of divine espionage, right? No, on the contrary, our goal is to play by the rules, to be completely legal in what we're doing, and to do otherwise would actually put us in kind of a questionable ground with relation to how we're living out our godly lives and honoring our Creator. So we're not trying to break rules here. We're trying to play by the rules. And so despite the provocative title of this episode and the other one, we're not actually talking about God at all. In fact, we're not even really trying to actively push or promote our religion or our beliefs. Instead, we're really just trying to talk about logic, reason, and philosophy in a way that is completely innocent and innocuous. Okay, and so the idea is that if someone ever does talk to the people that we're engaging, okay, if we're talking to people about these things, and then later on someone does have a chance to talk to them about God, that the idea is that they will be more likely to hear and receive what they're saying because of what we have talked to them about, because we've laid that philosophical groundwork, so to speak, that is compatible with Christianity. In other words, we're trying to establish the preconditions for a Christian worldview. J. Gresham Machen said that, quote, God usually exerts that power in connection with certain prior conditions of the human mind, and it should be ours to create, so far as we can with the help of God, those favorable conditions for the reception of the gospel. False ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel, end quote. And J.P. Moreland, in his book Love Your God with All Your Mind, talks about the importance of a plausibility structure. He says a person's plausibility structure is the set of ideas the person either is or is not willing to entertain as possibly true. And he goes on to say, if a culture reaches the point where Christian claims are not even part of its plausibility structure, fewer and fewer people will be able to entertain the possibility that they might be true. And he says that this is why apologetics is so crucial to evangelism. It seeks to create a plausibility structure in a person's mind, favorable conditions, as Machen puts it, so the gospel can be entertained by a person. To plant a seed in someone's mind in pre-evangelism is to present a person with an idea that will work on his or her plausibility structure to create a space in which Christianity can be entertained seriously. End quote. So when we're talking about pre-evangelism in this sense, we're not talking so much about what people need to know to become a Christian, but more so about what, if they do know these things, then it will make it easier for them to accept the gospel message when they hear it. And so we're working on their plausibility structure prior to presenting the gospel so that when they do hear it, it can at least be entertained as possibly true rather than immediately dismissed. So we're trying to identify what would be helpful for people to know and understand before taking that first step. So if we think about it as the narrow road that leads to life, we could ask ourselves what would pave the way, remove obstacles, and fill in the potholes of confusion for them to accept the gospel when they hear it. And so as a teacher, I like to give my students memory aids to help them remember information when they take a test. It's usually not perfect, but it gives them, a helpful framework to remember some of the basics. And so that's what I want to do for you in this episode. And so we're going to use John 14:6 as our memory aid. It says, Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then maybe we can use those very ideas to talk around Jesus when we can't talk about him. So in light of that, there are three main questions that we can ask. Well, number one, what are some common obstacles in the way of the gospel that we can try to remove? Number two, what do these people need to know about truth that would make it easier for them to accept the gospel? And number three, how can we answer the deep questions of life and meaning? So in the first episode that we did about this about a year or so ago, we focused mostly on that truth aspect. And we discussed the idea of objective truth and how truth is knowable even without absolute certainty. We talked about reasoning from effect back to a logical cause and how not all truth comes from science. So now we're going to continue in this episode. We're going to talk about the way. Okay, we're going to talk around Jesus by focusing on him as the way. So how can we set people up to know the way? How can we pave the way that leads to life? Okay, so let's start with this. You've probably seen that coexist bumper sticker that is made up of each of the letters is some sort of symbol representing a certain religion. Well, have you ever thought about what the problem with that bumper sticker, that image represents? There's a lot, right? There's a lot of problems with it. Okay? For one, it assumes way too much and overlooks some of the key beliefs and duties of some of the religions. First, for example, many devout Muslims believe it is their jihad, their duty to annihilate both Jews and Christians, the people of the book, the infidel. And even those that don't necessarily go that far with it are at least interested in converting them and Islamizing the rest of the world. And then, of course, Christians who are devoted to obeying the words of Christ, particularly in the Great Commission, would consider it basically a dereliction of duty to merely coexist without seeking to convert through missions and evangelism, and hence the topic of this podcast episode, right? So at the very heart of Christianity is the desire to see other gods and religions not coexist, but cease to exist out of a love for the adherents and a desire to see them commit their lives to Christ as the one true God and King. In fact, if Christianity is true and heaven and hell are real, then it would be unloving to do otherwise. So, in essence, this bumper sticker is communicating to the devotees of these religions that it's okay to believe so long as you do not that it doesn't affect your public life, right? It's okay for you to personally adhere to that religion so long as you are not obedient to all of its demands and actually live it out. In fact, they're trying to mandate how religious people should live out their faith, and which duties are appropriate and inappropriate. And so you can hold these beliefs, but you can't act in accordance with those beliefs. And isn't this the very definition of hypocrisy? Yet, this is the same ideology that encourages people to, quote unquote, be their authentic selves and demonizes the very hypocrisy that it demands. But perhaps even more problematic with this bumper sticker is the underlying assumption of this symbolic word. See, many people think that all religions are equally valuable or even equally true. However, this violates what's called the law of non-contradiction, which says that contradictory claims cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. The verse that we're using for our memory verse, John 14:6, says that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. So that one verse contradicts and excludes all other religions. And not only that, but there are many more contradictory claims among all the religions of the world. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they're all monotheistic, for example. But many Hindus are polytheistic, and other religions might be pantheistic or even atheistic. See, Christianity believes in the Trinity. As another example, that there is one God in three persons, but Judaism and Islam, well, they're strictly Unitarian. They don't believe in the Trinity. Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and Muslims believe that he was just merely a prophet. Christians believe Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead, and ascended into heaven. Jews don't believe that he rose from the dead, and Muslims don't even believe that Jesus died on the cross. So another example is that Christianity believes that we're saved by grace, but all other religions teach some sort of salvation by good works, if they teach salvation at all. And so you can see all of these contradictory claims. And in the words of Frank Turek, contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. We can believe everything is true, but we cannot make everything true. So these religions, well, they could all be false, but they cannot all be true. Nevertheless, what they hear in our culture today is that there are many ways to God. In fact, there's an old video of Oprah Winfrey discussing this on her talk show, and she says things like, one of the mistakes that humans make is believing that there is only one way to live. And then she goes on to say that there are, quote unquote, many paths to God, to what you call God, and her path might be something else. And when she gets there, she might call it the light. And Oprah also says, her loving kindness and generosity brings her to the same point that it brings you. It doesn't matter if she calls it God along the way or not. And then she makes this huge claim. It says there couldn't possibly be just one way. So those were all quotes from Oprah Winfrey during this one episode. And of course, one lady in the audience was bold enough to stand up and challenge Oprah, saying, there is one way and only one way, and that is through Jesus. She was right on, on the money on that statement. Of course, the conversation kind of takes a bit of a turn from there, and the audience member doesn't do the best job of defending Christianity beyond that. But this belief in universalism that Oprah is promoting is actually an obstacle to the way. Right? It's an obstacle in the way, preventing many people from becoming a Christian. After all, who would feel the need to convert to Christianity if they believe that all religions, and theirs in particular, are equally true and lead to the same place? Okay, why would they leave what they have, their own personal beliefs, and be able to live however they believe they should, want to live, if what they're doing is going to lead to the same place anyway? So it's an obstacle in the way of the gospel. So how do we then work the soil of their hearts? If we talk about the parable of the sower and how the seed fell on different types along the path, among the thorns, and on good soil. So where it takes root. So how do we work the soil and prepare that soil and do a little bit of gardening to help create those, what we were talking about, favorable conditions, in this case, for the reception of the one true gospel. How can we show people the way when we can't overtly tell them that Jesus is the way? Well, let's walk through another example similar to what we did in the previous episode of what this might look like. Okay? So here we go. Have you ever played the game Guess Who? It's where you take turns asking questions, like yes or no questions about the appearance of your opponent's character to narrow it down and guess who it is from the game board, right? Well, we're not going to play that game, but imagine playing like the reverse of that game, where I give you the who and you have to describe that person. So imagine that we're in a room full of people, and I ask for 3 volunteers to describe my wife. But the only catch is that none of them have ever met my wife or have any idea what she looks like. Well, nevertheless, I ask them to tell me her height, her weight, her hair color, her eye color, and so on. And one person describes her as, she's 5'2", weighs 110 pounds, has blonde hair and blue eyes. And then the next person goes on to describe her as, she's 5'5" and weighs 150 pounds, has dark hair and brown eyes. And then the third person, laughing at the impossibility of this task, jokes that, she's 4'6" and weighs 100 pounds, soaking wet, and has brown hair and green eyes. Well, this is an activity I got from J.P. Moreland, and first, they couldn't all be right. Right? My wife could not simultaneously satisfy all 3 descriptions. Second, sincerity is not enough. For example, one of them could sincerely believe that he was correct, and in fact persuade a million people that he was correct. But if my wife did not satisfy his description, then he and all his followers would simply be wrong. Well, my wife, to give you the answer to this, is about 5'5", has dirty blonde hair, blue eyes, and even if they were right about her weight, well, of course, I'm not allowed to say yes or no, right? Because I can't talk about that. So let me ask another question. So moving on, so let's talk about sports, okay? If I told you that the score, if I gave you the score of 94 to 102, who wins that matchup? Well, you'd probably say the score of 102 is the winner, right? And, if it were a basketball game, you'd be right. But what if you had a little bit more context, a little bit more information? And what if this was a game of golf? What if it was a golf match? And then the one with the score of 94 would be the winner, right? So what would you need to know in this case? You would have to know the purpose, the goals, the rules of the game. Because when you know the rules of the game, and that the goal in this case is to have the lowest score in golf, then you would know that the guy with 94 wins, right? But who determines those rules? Do the players determine the rules? No. It's above the players. They don't just show up and make the rules that day, right? It comes from above the players. It comes from the creator of the game itself. And so let's take that a step farther. What if the golfer with the score of 102 says, "No, I win"? Then he wins too, right? No, of course not. Not at the same time and in the same sense. He might win at an arm wrestling competition, or maybe like a beard growing contest, or he might have won the last time that they played, or maybe he'll win the next time that they play. But he can't both win and lose at the same time and in the same sense. So no matter how sincerely he believes that the goal of golf is to get the highest score, and no matter how hard he worked at that belief or how good he thought he played and lived out that belief, he simply cannot change the rules, purpose, and goals of golf because, he is not the creator of the game. So he does not have the authority to do so. And even if he could, it would no longer be the game of golf. It would be an entirely different game altogether. And so he would still not have won the game as it was originally intended. So we are not the ones who get to decide the way a sport is supposed to be played or the end goal of the game. And what about this? What about how we reach a particular destination? Is that something that we get to decide on our own? So since you might be using these strategies to talk around God to your coworkers, well, let's use your workplace as an example, okay? So does everybody take the same route to get to work, to get there, to your workplace? No. So does that mean that we actually are able to decide on our own how to get to a particular destination? Well, some of us don't get to decide because we just let our GPS do that for us, right? We plug it in to our GPS and we just listen to the voice from on high that guides us everywhere, right? But do we actually have some choice? Do we get to choose what road to take? Well, it might seem like that is the case, but when I lived in Louisiana, I would take Highway I-10, Interstate 10, to get to work. Now, I-10 runs pretty much from coast to coast and is one of the longest highways in the United States. But now that I live in Michigan and work in Michigan, I cannot take I-10 to get to work because it's in the southern part of this United States. So no matter how long you drive on I-10, it will never get you to work in Michigan, Montana, or Maine. So with that in mind, there are obviously some paths that are just not correct. And so then what makes a path the correct path? Whether it takes you to the correct location. The objective destination is what determines whether or not you are on the correct path. So if you plug your workplace into your GPS and to listen to the voice to guide you, what if it brought you to a place that had a similar name? What if you work for Amway, but your GPS brings you to Amtrak? What if your workplace is on Main Street in Salt Lake City, but your GPS brings you to Main Street in Kansas City? Well, there might be many places that seem like the right destination. It might have a similar name or the road might be called the same thing, but it doesn't matter how similar something appears to be. The bottom line is that you might think you have the right path to the right location, but if you're not where your boss expects you to show up to do your job, then you're at the wrong location. No matter how sincere you are, no matter how good you drive or obey all the traffic laws along the way, but the closer you get, the more that road narrows, right? Eventually, you will have to drive on the correct street, park in the correct parking lot, walk into the correct building, through the correct door, into the correct room or office where you are supposed to be working. Otherwise, you're just not going to get paid. So no matter what path you started on, in the end, the road is narrow. And it is it's ultimately the destination that determines whether or not the path was correct. So the closer you get to the destination, the fewer options you have. And in order to actually get to the right place, eventually you have to enter through that narrow door or gate, right? So we don't get to decide for ourselves if we took the right path. We also can't decide for ourselves what to call that place. We could call it Amtrak, but no matter how close that seems to Amway, we would just be wrong. And I don't think the one would give you a paycheck if you actually work for the other, right? So J.P. Moreland likens this to a maze. He says the goal is to reach the center of the maze, but which path will take you there? Some routes quickly lead to a dead end, while others take you deep into the maze only to eventually fail. Some paths run parallel to each other for long periods of time, only to have one hit a wall and while the other continues. The challenge is to find the one path that leads you to the final destination, the center. He goes on to say the only way to assess the effectiveness of a route is to consider where it takes you. Does the route lead you to a dead end, or does it take you to the center? So with so many choices, often leading in completely different directions, we have to ask ourselves what deficiencies found in a route will cause us to abandon this route and look for another. But again, the destination or goal is already set by the Creator. We don't get to determine the correct destination on our own. So to use another sports analogy, it's like the direction you go in a football game. So each end zone might look the same, but they are in opposite directions. And in crossing one goal line versus the other has real consequences. If you want to score points for your team, there's only one destination that will do that for you. You can have the greatest pass or the longest run, but if it's not in the right direction, if it doesn't end up in the correct end zone, it will not have the result that you're hoping for. So what makes a touchdown then better than a pick six, an interception for a touchdown, right? What makes a touchdown better? Well, the purpose, goals, and rules of the game determine what's good and what's bad. And the purpose comes from outside of the game. The teams don't get to make up the rules when they show up. In order to call a touchdown good and an interception bad, there has to be an ultimate purpose and goal of the game. And so understanding the purpose in the game is how you know what things bring you closer to that goal and what things bring you farther away. So let's pause right there. Now again, that might be all the time that you have in a conversation with someone, because we don't have to get them all the way to a certain spot, right? So let's look at what we have accomplished just in this short time, in this type of simulated conversation that we would have with someone. Because without talking about God or about Christianity, we have actually, number one, we've introduced the law of non-contradiction, which tells us that contradictory claims cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense, which is particularly important when it comes to the contradictory claims of different religions, right? Number two, we identify that sincerity of belief is not enough. No matter how sincerely you believe something, you might be just sincerely wrong. We do not have the authority to change the goals or purpose set by the Creator. Number three, we learn that although that there are many paths that might seem similar or even correct, it's not the journey but the objective destination that determines the validity of any given path. And finally, we need to know the purpose and goals and rules which come from the Creator. In order for some actions to be considered good and others bad in the quote-unquote game of life, there has to be a rule book, an ultimate purpose that comes from outside the game, a transcendent standard by which to measure. And this can be used even for setting up the moral argument for the existence of God. And so, which we did an episode about that a long time ago. You can look back in the archives to find more out about the moral argument for the existence of God. So let's go back to our memory aid. See, we've talked about how to remove some of the obstacles in the way to salvation. And in the previous episode, we discussed some things that people need to know about truth that will provide those favorable conditions. And finally, let's look at how we can talk around God by focusing on Jesus as the source of life and meaning. So after college, I lived in Louisiana for 13 years. It's actually where my wife and I met, and we got married, and both of our kids were born there. Of course, Louisiana is a culture all in itself. And it feels in many ways like a different country compared to a lot of the rest of the country. And so I lived in the Baton Rouge area, but if you drive an hour in basically any direction in Louisiana, you get a different accent and even sometimes a different culture. And of course, one of those cultures is the Cajun culture. Cajuns are famous for their food, but they also have these jokes called Boudreaux and Thibodeau jokes. Because those are common last names in Cajun country, Boudreaux and Thibodeau. And so the jokes are always about these two old Cajun guys who are, not the sharpest tools in the shed. But these jokes, they have to be told, if they're going to work, they only work if you tell them in the thick Cajun accent. So for all of my Louisiana friends out there who are listening to this, I apologize ahead of time for how bad my Cajun accent is. But so please don't hold that against me. But I have to tell this Boudreaux and Thibodeau joke using, the best Cajun accent I got. You ready? So here we go. So Boudreaux and Thibodeau, they went fishing, and they found a spot where they was catching lots and lots of fish. And so Boudreaux says to Thibodeau, he says, "Mais Thibodeau, we need to mark this spot so we remember it and catch a lot of fish again." And Thibodeau said, "Now, how you going to do that, Boudreaux?" And so Boudreaux said to Thibodeau, he said, "Well, we'll just mark an X in the bottom of the boat." Now Thibodeau said, "Mais Boudreaux, how you know we're going to use the same boat next time?" So I hope you found that funny. I think it's funny. But it's the only Boudreaux and Thibodeau joke I can ever remember, and I'm just not very good at remembering jokes. Besides, I got a few of my classic dad jokes, but that's about it. But I enjoyed this joke. But I got to thinking about it, about how our culture is a lot like this. People are taught to, quote unquote, follow their heart and look within to find meaning and purpose. But they don't see the problem. They're floating through life, gazing at the X in the bottom of their own boat, right? Thinking that it's going to tell them where all the fish are. They're looking within themselves, thinking that that's where all the answers to life and the deep questions of life and meaning and purpose come from. But all the while wondering why they're not, quote, catching the fish and finding that meaning and not fulfilling their purpose and finding contentment in life. It's like having a compass that is always pointing to yourself. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good. And when they do realize and recognize the problem with that way of thinking, well, they see the wrong problem. They just think that, everybody has their own boat, so it's just you do you. And we just have to look in the right boat, right? Well, they fail to see that the answers to the questions of meaning and purpose and fulfillment, they don't come from inside the boat. They're not found within our own hearts. They come from outside the boat. They're anchored in objective reality, in the created order. And so in the first episode I did about this, I talked about having a $20 bill in my wallet. So let's go back to that idea of a $20 bill for a moment. And if I had a $20 bill in my wallet, how much would that be worth? It's kind of a silly question, right? Of course, it would be worth $20. Well, what if I had another $20 bill in my wallet, except the only difference is that I made that one for myself? That one's worth $20 too, right? Of course not. How much would it be worth then? Nothing, right? Unless I can find some sucker to buy it from me. Because I may have grabbed a piece of paper and I drew $20 bill on it and made a smiley face in the middle. Okay? But what if I believe that it's very valuable? I mean, I created it for myself. Shouldn't I get to decide its value? Maybe you're just jealous. Maybe, why don't you just make your own $20 bills? I'll tell you what, let's say if you send me $10, I'll make you a $20 bill and send it to you. Would you take that offer? Probably not. Why? Because you'd be doubling your money, wouldn't you? What if I made you a $100 bill and send it to you for $10? Give me a $10 donation. I'll send you a $100 bill that I made by myself. Still, no. So if let's say I made a $100 bill for myself, and you had a regular, real $20 bill, would I really be 5 times richer than you? Of course not. But what is the difference between this real $20 bill and the $20 bill that I made for myself on a piece of paper? Why don't they have the same value? Where does the value come from? The value of the real $20 bill comes from the government. Why? Because they printed it. They created it. We can't just assign our own value, right? The value depends on the authority of the creator. So the fake $20 bill might hold value to me, but that's just subjective value. Its value does not come from that transcendent authority. Well, what about human beings? Can we create our own meaning and value? I mean, we can try, just like I did with a $20 bill on a piece of paper, but we can't expect it to mean much to others, right? After all, they presumably have created their own value and meaning. So where does our dignity and value come from then? Does our value come from the government, like the $20 bill? No, of course not. Are some humans more valuable than other humans? For instance, are Hollywood celebrities more valuable than the slaves of the antebellum South? Or are famous athletes or politicians more valuable than preborn human beings that are still inside the womb? No. We know that all men and women are created equal. But how do we know that? Is it just because the Declaration of Independence tells us? It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, if the government is who gives us rights and value, then the government could also take those rights away from us. So what is the role of government then? Well, the Declaration of Independence says this again. It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. Well, the government can only secure these rights. In fact, if, as the Declaration of Independence says, that people have the right to alter or abolish the government, those rights certainly can't come from the government, right? Now, of course, we've done an episode about human rights, and there are some rights that come from the government, but the universal human rights and value and dignity, okay, that does not come from the government. So you can go back and listen to that episode in the archives about where the human rights come from. But the idea is that those rights cannot come from the government. They must appeal to something beyond the government. If rights come from the government, local, federal, or global, then if the government doesn't grant you that right, then you simply don't have it, and nor do you have any basis for demanding it. And if rights come from the government, then it makes no sense to say that you have a right to something that the government hasn't given you. So let's switch gears a bit here and go back one more time to that $20 bill, the real one, right? Is it only valuable because of what it's made of? You know, I actually found out not too long ago that the paper money, the bills of the United States currency, is actually made up of about 25% linen and 75% cotton. So does that mean that if I use just the right proportions of linen and cotton and figure out how to add in all the right watermarks and the security ribbons and so on, that my $20 bill that I made on paper, that I created for myself, that it'll finally be valuable? No, because what it's made of doesn't make it valuable. The value comes from beyond the physical components. Again, how does this apply to our lives? If life is made up of just matter, physics, and chemistry, if we're just molecules in motion, is there any way for those to make our lives valuable? No, because our value does not come from what we are made of. If we just evolved this way, is there any way that makes human life more valuable than animals or plants or even non-life? Our value has to come from beyond what we're made of, from beyond what the government says about us, from beyond what we can create for ourselves. There has to be something or someone that to assign us value, some sort of source for dignity and worth. Now, let's pause here because I want to offer a word of caution. See, when we talk about meaning, we want to be careful to not accidentally communicate that there's no meaning or purpose to life. This is a dangerous and frankly untrue message. Rather, we have to help them understand that their worldview offers them no lasting source for real and true meaning. And this is what Francis Schaeffer calls taking the roof off. But we must remind ourselves that this is not a game. Schaeffer says that, quote, the Christian lovingly must remove the shelter and allow the truth of the external world and of what man is to beat upon him. When the roof is off, each man must stand naked and wounded before the truth of what is, end quote. So the reality is that they actually have more value and meaning than they can create for themselves. Schaeffer goes on to say, quote, as I push the man off his false balance, he must be able to feel that I care for him. Otherwise, I will only end up destroying him, and the cruelty and ugliness of it all will destroy me as well. Pushing him towards the logic of his presuppositions is going to cause him pain. Therefore, I must not push any further than I need to, end quote. The point is that we want to show them the incorrect or missing pieces in their puzzle, in their worldview puzzle. What is the first thing that you do when you realize that you're missing a puzzle piece? You go look for it. You seek it out. So this is what we should aim for. We want to show them the missing pieces in their worldview puzzle so they can begin looking for answers. We want people to seek out the missing pieces in their worldview puzzle so that they can make sense of it when they find it. And so even if we can't give them that piece outright, we want them to look for it. We want to encourage them to seek it out. Again, without talking openly about God, we've showed them that their worldview is missing some pieces about the deep questions of life and meaning. We cannot create our own meaning and value, but it has been bestowed upon us by God as the supreme authority and the fact that he made us in his image. So we've identified that universal human rights cannot come from the government, but must come from beyond or above the government. Just to be able to claim rights that the government hasn't already given us. Now, you might say that we mentioned the Creator in the Declaration of Independence, but since when can you not talk openly with people about the Declaration of Independence, even in schools or other situations, right? And finally, we've shown that life is more than matter, physics, and chemistry, because those things, they also cannot bestow value. But we have to be careful about how hard we push them towards the idea that their worldview offers them no sufficient answers to the big questions of life and meaning and value, because this can be a crushing blow. So we need to expose them to the truth of the external world, but we need to be there to help them walk through how to deal with that. So when I was in college, I had a missions professor named Dr. Raymond Smith. And he was my favorite professor, and he had a profound impact on my life. And he's a passionate man who at one time in his life was a missionary in Italy, and yet years later his heart still burned with passion for the nations, even to the point of bringing him to tears. And I remember that at the end of every week, Dr. Smith would end class by saying the same thing. And I remember it very clearly to this day. He would say, wear your seatbelts, guard your hearts, abstain from all appearance of evil. Remember that 5 seconds of indiscretion can destroy a lifetime of testimony. And then he would tell us to have a good weekend. When I first began teaching in a private Christian school, I adopted Dr. Smith's Friday saying and would share it with my students as well. So, when I moved into the public schools, I of course quickly realized that even if it were safe and okay to share with my non-Christian students in a public school, they simply just wouldn't understand it. And so They would not know what it means to abstain from the appearance of evil, or what a testimony is, or how 5 seconds of indiscretion, whatever that is, could destroy you, right? So I realized that this wouldn't really work for me anymore. But recently, I've been thinking of ways to modify it in a way that we can talk around God, even when we can't talk about Him. And I've been thinking long and hard about what that might look like for whether it's in a school or just in general, the types of message that we can communicate to people to work on their plausibility structure or provide those favorable conditions for the gospel. And so, what if we were able to frame it a little bit more like this and say, wear your seatbelts, guard your hearts, but don't be misled by them. Value the truth above opinion. Remember that life is more than matter, and your life's meaning has been given to you, not found within you, because it's greater than you can create for yourself. Have a good weekend. Of course, each of those things has some deeper meaning to it, but hopefully it can be more than just good advice, right? Hopefully it can help get people thinking and asking questions that might open the door to some meaningful conversations. So I want to end this episode much like how I ended the original one about this stuff that I released a year or so ago, with a reminder that, some of us might be thinking and wondering, well, we didn't really talk about God, or we didn't really talk about or even religion or our beliefs, when we walk through some of these scenarios and simulations. But so we might think, okay, well, what does this all have to do with leading people to Christ? But I want to remind you that what the great Francis Schaeffer once said. He says, quote, "All the cultural, intellectual, or philosophic material is not to be separated from leading people to Christ. Talking about metaphysics, morals, and epistemology is part of my evangelism." Remember, without a little gardening, without a little pre-work and preparing the soil, you can't reap a crop. So while we might not be in a position where we can openly plant those seeds of the gospel, we can still certainly play a part in the harvest. So thank you guys so much for listening again. And if you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful, please make sure to share it with your friends or family so that they can benefit from it too. If you haven't done so already, I would love for you to like and subscribe to the podcast. And I'd really appreciate it if you would rate and review it wherever you listen. And of course, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and visit our website, encounteringtruth.org. Now, remember, let's make it our goal to examine the evidence, engage culture, and encounter Jesus. God bless. We'll see you next time.